I want to tell you what those 12 hours were, and what they cost. But the honest truth is, I still don't remember them. I remember everything before. I remember everything after. The gap in the middle. Those 12 hours on a dark stretch of desert highway, where my sister Melissa vanished and my cancer disappeared. That part belongs to something else. Something older than the highway, older than the desert, older than any name we have for the dark between the stars. I've had a long time to sit with that. I've decided it's all right. Some things aren't ours to keep. Let me start from the beginning. Because the beginning matters. The beginning is what tells you who I was before they chose me, and who I had to become after. I was 34 years old when Dr. Ham told me I had 8 weeks. That's how he said it. Not 8 weeks to live, just 8 weeks. As if the living part was already understood to be finished. The cancer had started in my left breast 2 years prior. I'd done everything right. Surgery, chemo, the whole brutal catalog of modern medicine's best guesses. And then one afternoon in his office, with the afternoon light coming through the blinds in that particular flat way that only happens in a doctor's office, he showed me the scans and said, 8 weeks. And I sat there looking at the light on his desk, and I didn't cry. I want you to understand that I didn't cry. Not because I was brave. Not because I was numb. I didn't cry. Because Melissa was sitting in the chair beside me, and she was already crying for both of us, which meant I couldn't. That's what Melissa did. She felt things first and loudest, and I'd spent my whole life letting her lead the feeling so I could keep functioning. She was 3 years younger than me and had been taking care of me in every way that mattered since the diagnosis. And when I heard 8 weeks, I looked at her face and made a decision so fast, I didn't even know I was making it. I would not add my grief to hers. She was carrying enough. So I sat there and I took the paper he slid across the desk and I said, "Thank you, doctor," and I meant it without irony. And then I took Melissa's hand and we walked out to the parking lot together in the bright November afternoon. She drove. I'd stopped driving 6 months earlier when the fatigue got bad enough that I didn't trust myself behind the wheel. Melissa drove the way she did everything. With both hands tight on the wheel, too much attention, as if driving harder could fix something. We didn't talk for the first 20 miles. The desert opened up on both sides of the highway, the way it does when you've left the city behind. Long and flat and red-brown, and absolutely indifferent to human problems. I remember thinking that the desert looked the same to a dying woman as it did to anyone else. It seemed somehow. The desert didn't know. Melissa finally said, "There's a clinic in Tucson. Alternative therapies." I read about it. I said, "Mel, I know what you're going to say. Then don't make me say it." She tightened her hands on the wheel. Outside, the sun was going down behind the hills to the west, and the sky had turned that particular deep orange that you only see in the desert, layered and heavy, like something burning at a great distance. I was watching it. I had decided weeks ago to watch things carefully, to look at things as if they were the last time, because some of them were going to be. Then the car stopped. Not slowed, stopped, as if someone had reached down from outside and simply held it still. The engine didn't cut out. The engine kept running. I could feel it. The dashboard lights were all on. But the car was not moving and would not move. Melissa pumped the accelerator. Nothing. She looked at me. I looked at her. Then the light came. I've tried to describe it many times since, and I've never gotten it right. It was white the way that description fails completely. White makes you think of snow or walls or fluorescent ceiling panels, and this was none of those things. It was white the way that a sound can be so loud it stops being a sound and becomes a pressure, a physical fact. Came from above. It came from everywhere. It came from inside my chest. Melissa was saying my name. I heard it for just a moment, her voice going tight with that particular fear that you hear when someone cannot run and cannot fight, and doesn't know what to do with the fear in their body. And then there was nothing. And that was all I knew for 12 hours. I woke with my face against the car window. The glass was cold. The desert outside was the flat gray of early morning. No color yet, just the shapes of things in bad light. The engine had stopped at some point. My mouth tasted like copper and salt. My head felt the way it does after you've been under general anesthesia. That particular heavy wrongness, that sense of time having been removed from you rather than simply past. I sat up. The passenger seat beside me was empty. Melissa. I said it flat, not a question, the way you say someone's name when you already know the answer, but your mouth hasn't caught up with your brain yet. I looked in the back seat. I looked out the window at the highway, which was empty in both directions, as far as I could see. I opened the car door and stood on the asphalt in the cold morning air, and the cold was absolute. The desert at dawn is a different place than the desert at any other hour, stripped of everything warming. Just the rock and the sand and the hard blue beginning of light. Melissa. The desert answered with nothing. Not silence exactly. There was wind, and far off to the north the sound of a hawk, and the ticking of the cooling engine. But nothing that was Melissa, and nothing that was any other human thing. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I was not confused. I was not disoriented. My mind was perfectly clear the way that cold water is clear. I looked at the empty passenger seat, and the empty highway, and the empty sky, and I understood immediately that something had happened that I did not have a category for, and I chose, consciously, deliberately, not to invent one yet. Find out what had happened. That was the thing to do. Find out, then respond. Grief could come later. Grief was a luxury for when you had more facts. I found my phone in the door pocket. It had no signal. I started walking. Detective Carter found me 2 miles down the highway an hour later. He was already my boyfriend at that point. We'd been together 8 months, which in retrospect I think was the alien equivalent of scheduling, though I didn't know that yet. Carter was a solid, practical man who believed in evidence and procedure, and did not believe in much else. When I told him that my car had stopped, that there had been a light, that Melissa was gone, he did not say, "I believe you," and he did not say, "That's impossible." He said, "Okay, go back to the car." That was Carter. Evidence first, always evidence first. He filed a missing persons report. He worked the case with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to everything else in his life. He drove every road within 50 miles of that stretch of highway. He interviewed the 3 people who lived within viewing distance of that section of the desert. He pulled traffic camera footage from the near intersection, 7 miles away, which showed our car passing normally at 6:14 p.m. and showed nothing afterward, because there were no cameras on that stretch, and no one had ever thought to put any there. He talked to truckers who ran that route. He looked at satellite imagery. He made phone calls to agencies in 2 states. Melissa did not turn up, not a trace. A phone ping, not a credit card hit, not a single camera anywhere in 3 counties. She had simply ceased to exist in the physical record of the world, with the completeness of something that had never been there. 3 weeks after that night, I went to my oncology appointment because Ham's office had called to schedule what I understood to be a final assessment. Pain management options, hospice referrals, the end of the clinical story. I sat in the chair, across from Ham's desk, and he put the new scan on the light box, and we both looked at it for a long moment. "I don't understand what I'm looking at," he said. I did. The cancer was gone, not reduced. Not in remission in the cautious, hedged way that oncologists use the word when they're afraid to commit. Gone. The mass in my chest was not there. The metastases in my liver and my lymph nodes were not there. Blood panels, which he'd run twice because he didn't believe the first results, showed nothing. No markers, no anomalies, nothing but a perfectly healthy woman in her mid-30s. My hair had already grown back. I'd noticed that in the shower 3 days earlier, a full inch of hair that hadn't been there the week before, and I'd stood there with water running over my face and made myself think about it, carefully, instead of feeling anything about it. Something had changed my biology. Something had rewritten the code. The cancer was a fact. The cancer was gone. Therefore, something had acted on my body during those 12 hours. Those were the things I knew. I still didn't know where Melissa was. And that was the only question that mattered. Ham said spontaneous remission because he needed a phrase to put in the chart, and I let him. I didn't tell him about the light. I didn't tell him about the 12 hours. I had already decided, sitting in that parking lot 8 weeks earlier listening to my sister cry, that I was going to be the one who functioned. You can feel wonder later. First you function. I spent the next 2 months looking for Melissa. Carter helped. Carter helped with everything, more than I had any right to ask of him. Because by then he had figured out that the woman he'd started dating 8 months ago was not the same woman who had walked away from that highway, and he was still there. He pulled every missing persons database. He followed every lead that appeared, and many that didn't appear to be leads at all. He was also quietly, without making a project of it, looking into what might cause a car to stop on a dark highway, what might cause 12 hours of missing time, what the documented cases were. He did this the way he did everything. Methodically, without announcement, and he told me what he found the same way. There were more documented cases than either of us had expected. The literature was thin and marginal, and mostly published in places that serious people didn't read, but the pattern was consistent. A blinding light, a period of missing time, a biological change in the surviving witness. Sometimes it was healing, sometimes it was the opposite. A subtraction, a degradation, something removed that had kept the person whole. The survivors who found each other online were not the kind of people who appeared credible to a mainstream audience. But their reports had a specificity, a consistency of detail, that I had learned to distinguish from the general texture of invention. I found the book in a used bookshop on the east side of the city. It was called Lost Time, which was the phrase I'd been using when I searched online, and it was written by a doctor, Xavier Reed. The book was self-published and looked at. Thin paper, inconsistent margins, the kind of typography that happens when someone produces a book themselves, because no conventional publisher would take it. But the content was different. From the fringe material I'd been reading, Reed wrote with the precision of a scientist and the restraint of someone who knows exactly how he sounds to a mainstream audience, and has decided the truth is worth sounding that way. He described the phenomenon of missing time not as a supernatural event, but as a biological one. Something being done to a specific class of human beings whose genetic profile met a particular criterion. He called them candidates. He described the light. He described the car stopping. He described the wrongness of the air in those last conscious seconds, with a precision that made my hands go still on the page. He had a clinic. The address was in the back of the book. Carter ran Reed through every database he had access to, and came back with almost nothing, which he told me was itself unusual. A man with a published book and an active clinical practice should have a more substantial paper trail than Xavier Reed possessed. I remember him sitting at my kitchen table with his laptop open, turning the book over in his hands. His face had the particular stillness it got when he was working something through, that he didn't like the shape of. Clinics licensed, he said. That much is real, but his academic credentials don't trace fact anywhere I can verify. It's like he appeared fully formed about 12 years ago. No doctoral thesis, no undergraduate records, no professional history before that. People change their names, I said. People change their names and still leave traces. He doesn't have traces. He has a present and no past, which is a specific kind of construction. He looked at me. I don't think you should go there alone. I said, I'm going to the clinic, Valerie. She's my sister, Carter. He knew better than to argue with that. What he did instead was what Carter always did. He made a plan. He would drive me to the clinic, establish contact, maintain daily check-ins. If a check-in was missed at the appointed time, he would come immediately. We went over the protocol the same way we went over everything. Practically, without drama, treating it as a logistics problem rather than the terrifying thing it actually was. I did not tell him how afraid I was. There was no point in telling him. He could see it and he was still making the plan. The clinic was in the high desert, 3 hours from the city. The building was low and white, and surrounded by that particular deliberate plainness that expensive places sometimes have. No signs, no visible staff. A gravel drive flanked by stones that had been placed there with the care of something that wanted to appear natural. A woman met me at the door. She introduced herself as Nurse Mary. She had a calm that was total and seamless, the calm of a deep river rather than still water. And I noted it the way I noted everything by then, as data to be filed, not felt. She showed me to a room. The room was clean and spare. The window looked out at the desert. I asked when I would see Dr. Reed, and she said he would meet with me after I'd rested from the drive, and I said I didn't need rest. And she smiled with perfect warmth and said, "Of course." The door, when she left, locked from the outside. Not loudly, just the small decisive click of a deadbolt driven home. I stood at the window and looked at the desert for a long time. I thought about the way the room smelled, clean, antiseptic, but with something underneath that I couldn't identify, something organic and faintly wrong, like the smell of a place where living things had been kept for purposes they weren't told about. I thought about Nurse Mary's hands, which had been perfectly proportioned and smooth in a way that hands are not after years of clinical work. I thought about the car on the highway and the light and the 12 hours, and my sister's empty seat. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I was genuinely afraid in a way that had nothing to do with the cancer or the dying, which I had made my peace with already, but which had everything to do with the not knowing. There is a kind of fear that is just the body's response to a threat it can't identify. I felt it standing at that window. I breathed through it. I had come here to find Melissa, and being afraid of the place I'd come to was not going to help me find her. That evening I met the others. Four of them in the group session that Reed's associate, a man named Elliot, led in the common room. Elliot had the same seamless calm as Mary, and the same hands. Too smooth, too proportioned, with a stillness in them that I found I couldn't stop noticing once I'd started. 4 patients were named Eva, Jillian, Gail, and Rico, and they were to varying degrees broken. Not in the way that grief breaks people, or loss breaks people, or even illness breaks people. I knew what all of those looked like from the inside. They were broken in the way that something essential had been removed from them. The way a machine breaks when a load-bearing component is taken out. They functioned, they spoke, they answered questions with appropriate words at appropriate times. But there was something behind their eyes that was absent, some quality of selfhood that should have been there and was not. Eva had been a nurse. She told me so in the flat, careful way of someone recounting a fact from another person's life. She said that before the light she had been a pediatric nurse for 11 years, that she had loved the work, that children had made sense to her in a way that most other things didn't, and that now she could not make herself care about anything at all. Cruel, not angry, just empty, the way a house is empty, the structure intact, the warmth gone. Jillian had been a schoolteacher for 23 years. Same story, different detail. She'd had a classroom full of 6th graders who sent her a card every year at Christmas, and now the cards arrived. And she put them in a drawer and did not open them because opening them required something she could no longer locate in herself. Go had owned a landscaping business and coached his son's soccer team. Gail had been a grandmother of 4 who baked bread on Sundays and had opinions about everything, and had apparently been, by her own account, delivered in that careful, empty voice, exhausting to be around in the best possible way. I listened to all of it. I asked careful questions. I did not tell them what I was actually looking for. I watched Elliot at the edge of the room, standing with that particular stillness, and I thought, "You are not what you appear to be, and you are not worried about me noticing, and that itself tells me something about how many people have walked into this room and not looked at you clearly." I planned to look at everything clearly. Dr. Reed met with me the following morning. He was a tall man with a deliberate quality to his movement, every gesture considered, every word placed with the care of someone who has thought about how humans respond to language and applied that thinking. He had the kind of face that reads as kind without being warm. The face of a man who has decided kindness is a useful tool and deployed it accordingly. He sat across from me in a room that might have been an office, except that it had no windows, and the walls were a slightly wrong shade of white. White the way that a reproduction of a painting is almost the color of the original, without quite being it. He folded his hands on the desk between us, and looked at me with eyes that were, I realized, slowly slightly too still. Human eyes move constantly. Even when you're looking at something fixed, your eyes make small adjustments, tiny tremors of focus that you're not aware of because your brain smooths them out. These eyes didn't do that. They were fixed in a way that was subtly, persistently wrong, and the longer I sat across from them, the more that wrongness accumulated into something I couldn't ignore. He said, "You're different from the others," I said. "How?" "Most people who come here are looking for an explanation, framework, that makes the experience bearable. You're not looking for that." "No." What are you looking for, my sister? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you know about genetics, Valerie?" I told him I knew enough. He nodded slowly, as if I'd passed a test he'd set without announcing it. What Reed explained to me over the next hour I will try to give you plainly, stripping away the careful language he wrapped it in. Because I think the plain version is what matters. There is a genetic marker in a small percentage of human beings. Reed called it the God gene, though I think that name was chosen to appeal to a human frame of reference, rather than accurately describe the thing. It's a sequence in the base code that marks its bearer as belonging to an older branch of the human family tree, a branch that diverged at some point in the deep past before the modern version of the species fully established itself. The marker is rare. It is also, for reasons Reed said were too complex to explain, in a single conversation, the specific thing his people needed. His people. He said that, without hesitation, the way you say it when you're past the point of maintaining a particular pretense. I kept my face neutral. Carter had taught me that, and also my mother had, in her own way. Keep your face neutral, and your hands still when the information is more important than your reaction to it. The reaction could come later. Right now, the information mattered. Reed told me that his race was dying. He said it without evident distress, the way a clinician states a diagnosis, as information to be managed rather than mourned. They had been dying for a long time. Long enough that a long time translated into geological epochs rather than generations. They had identified, at some point in their distant past, that the human genome carried an analog of what they were losing, a coding structure that their own species had possessed before a catastrophic population bottleneck, deep in their own history, had reduced it to near extinction in their gene pool. They had been looking for it since, systematically, across a very long time and a very large number of candidates. They called it the God gene, he said again, and smiled slightly, and I realized he was watching to see if the name would move me. I did not let it move me. "Melissa has the marker," I said. He paused for just a fraction of a second before answering. Just a fraction. But I had been watching for it. "Yes," he said, "and I don't." Another pause. Shorter this time, more controlled. "Your case is more unusual." I looked at him and said nothing. I had learned from a decade of dealing with doctors that doctors fill silence. It was apparently a more widespread reflex than I had realized. "Cancer," he said, had mutated in a way we did not anticipate. The tumor had acquired the marker through a process of genetic drift in the malignant tissue. We did not realize until the process had begun that what we were looking for was in the tumor rather than the base genome. When we removed it from you, when we extracted the sequence we needed, we also extracted what the cancer needed to survive. Tumor was expressing the marker. The marker was gone. Tumor had nothing to maintain itself. I let that sit for a moment. "You healed me by accident." We corrected an unanticipated error in our extraction process. The error being that you took something from me without my consent. He tilted his head very slightly. The alternative was your death within weeks. You had almost no time remaining. That's not an answer to what I said. It's the honest one. We gave you your life. You gave me a side effect of your procedure. That is not the same thing as giving me my life. I looked at him steadily. "Took my sister." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the windowless room, somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. I had been mapping sounds since I arrived. The building's acoustic patterns, the location of movement. The sound came from the direction I'd identified as the eastern wing. "Melissa is completing her final course of treatment," Reed said. "Treatment," I said. "That's what you call it." "It's an accurate description of the process. And when her treatment is complete, she'll be returned. The others." I looked at him. Like Eva and Jillian, like Gail and Rico, a pause that was longer than the others. They were returned. They were put back in their bodies with something missing. That's not the same as being returned. I kept my voice even. I had no leverage in this room and I knew it. What I had was time. Carter was coming, and the question was whether Melissa had time. "I want to see her." "That's not possible at this stage of Dr. Reed." I used the same voice I had used with Ham in his office. Flat, final. The voice of a woman who has been told the worst thing and is still in the room. "I came here for my sister. For your framework, not for your history. I'd like to see her now." He looked at me for a long moment. Two still eyes were unreadable. Then he stood and said, "I'll see what can be arranged," and left the room. The door locked behind him. I had expected that. I stood up and walked the perimeter of the room anyway, because that is what you do when you've been locked in a room. You test the perimeter. You establish the facts. You do not waste time being angry about the facts. There was one door and no windows. The walls were drywall over a frame that I could tell from the sound was solid. There was a ventilation grill high on the wall to the east. I went back to the chair and sat down and thought about Carter. He was due to call me at 11 p.m. I had arranged that time deliberately, late enough that anyone monitoring my communications would register it as a personal call, not a scheduled check-in. What I had also arranged, in a conversation I'd had with Carter on the drive here, was a secondary protocol. If I sent him a text at any point with a specific phrase, we had agreed on "I forgot to feed the cat," which neither of us had a cat, so the phrase would not appear accidentally. He would treat it as an immediate emergency and come regardless of the time. I had sent that text 40 minutes after arriving at the clinic, sitting in my room with the locked door and the desert outside the window. Whether or not Reed's people were monitoring my outgoing messages, the text had gone before they would have had time to establish that monitoring. I had counted on that window. Carter was coming. The question was whether he would get here before Reed decided what to do with me, and the answer to that question depended on how much they underestimated the specific human woman sitting in their locked room. They had underestimated me already. I was counting on them to keep doing it. The door opened 2 hours later, and it was not Reed who came through it but Nurse Mary, and she was not alone. The thing beside her was not wearing the kind of disguise I had been imagining, which I think had been influenced by too many movies. I'd pictured something almost human, something carefully assembled to pass at close range. It was not that. It was tall. Taller than the doorframe should have comfortably allowed, and the geometry of it was wrong in a way that took several seconds to process, because your brain keeps trying to resolve what it's seeing into something familiar, and it couldn't. Long fingers, very long, the joints arranged in a way that suggested more of them than human hands have. The light in the room seemed to behave differently near it, as if the air itself was paying attention to something it recognized. It looked old in a way that the word old doesn't cover. Old the way a geological formation is old, where age has become a category rather than a quantity. I did not scream. I will tell you that not because I think it was brave, but because I think it's the most honest thing I can report about the moment. I simply did not scream. I had been dying by degrees for 2 years. I had sat in a chair while a doctor said 8 weeks, and I had taken the paper from his desk and thanked him. I had walked alone in the cold dawn on a desert highway, with the metallic taste of altered time in my mouth and an empty seat where my sister had been. I had already said goodbye to most of what I'd held on to. There is a kind of calm that becomes available to you on the other side of that. It's not courage. It's just what's left when most of the fear has already been used up on things that turned out to be merely human. I looked at it. It looked at me, or did the thing it did that corresponded to looking. And I thought, you have been watching humanity for a very long time, and in all that time you learned to see the species and not the person. You learned to see the marker and not the woman. 12 hours of my life, and 4 months of my sister's, and you walked into this room expecting what? Panic? Collapse? The ordinary human response to the impossible? What I actually said was, "Where is Melissa?" It didn't answer. Mary answered, in her smooth, seamless voice. "Melissa is completing her final session. She'll be ready to." "Final session," I said. "What does that mean exactly?" Mary's smile did not waver. "Process will be complete within." "What happens to the ones who aren't well afterward?" I looked at her steadily. Eva, Jillian, Gail, Rico, what was taken from them in their final sessions? Nothing. Just the smile, and the tall thing beside her, and the locked room with the door standing open. I had been looking at that door since they came through it. It opened inward. Mary was standing to the right of the opening, the thing to the left, and there was a gap between Mary and the doorframe of approximately 18 inches. I am 5 feet 4 inches tall, and at the time I weighed 112 pounds, less than I'd weighed at any adult point in my life. The cancer and the searching having reduced me to something close to fundamental. 112 pounds fits through 18 inches. If you commit to it. I stood up from the chair. I moved toward the door at a pace that was not running. Running triggers pursuit, and I needed 2 steps before I could make the gap. And you do not waste the 2 steps. Got the first step before Mary's hand came down on my arm with a grip that was completely unmistakably wrong. Not stronger than it should have been, but different. The pressure distributed in a way that no human hand distributes pressure, covering too much of the circumference of my arm with too little effort. Pulled against it once. Hard. Felt it give approximately 2 inches, and then hold. And then I stopped pulling and instead dropped my weight straight down, the way Carter had shown me when I'd asked him to teach me something real rather than something theoretical. Mary's grip tracked down my arm as I dropped, and I twisted underneath it and came up on the other side of her and went through the door. The corridor outside was long and white. I turned right because right led toward the exterior wall, which I'd established during my first hour in the facility by looking at the heating ducts. Exterior walls have different duct configurations than interior ones, a fact Carter had mentioned once, while we were talking about something entirely different that I'd filed away without knowing I'd need it. He'd said it so casually. I was glad I'd been listening. I found Melissa behind the third door I tried. She was sitting in a chair, very like the chair I'd been sitting in a room very like my room, and she was awake and looking at the door as if she'd known it was going to open. She looked at me and I looked at her, and for a moment neither of us said anything because there was too much to say, and absolutely no time to say any of it. She looked thin. She looked like she'd been thin for a long time and had stopped fighting it. She had the same quality I'd seen in Eva and Jillian and Rico and Gail, that diminished quality, that sense of something removed from behind the eyes, but hers was less total. Sure. The process, as Reed had said, was not yet complete. She was still Melissa. She was still in there looking out, she said. Val, I said, can you walk? She looked at me for just a second with something that was almost the old Melissa look. That combination of exasperation and love, and the particular certainty that I was about to do something difficult. Yes, she said. Then walk. We went down the corridor together. I held her arm because she was unsteady. Not incapacitated, just weak. The weakness of someone who has spent months in a chair. I was moving us toward the building's front. I had the phone in my hand and I was watching for signal as we moved. One bar appearing and disappearing as we turned corners. And I kept moving. What I was not accounting for was Elliot. He came from a side corridor with the same wrongness of geometry the others had. Movement that didn't quite obey the rules, and he put himself in front of us in a way that covered both directions, without apparent urgency. He said nothing. Standing was its own statement. I said, "You've taken what you came for. Nothing. Whatever's in her genetic code, whatever sequence you needed, you told me the session is nearly complete, which means you have it. There's no reason to hold her." The 2 still eyes, fixed on me with that geological patience. "I want to tell you something," I said. My voice was steady. I was aware of Melissa's hand in mine, of how thin her fingers were, of the slight tremor in her that she was trying to suppress. I had terminal cancer. I was weeks from dying when you took your 12 hours from me on that highway. The thing you removed from my tumor cells, the sequence you were looking for. It was inside the cancer. You removed it from the malignant tissue. And when you did that, you removed what the cancer needed to sustain itself. You healed me as a direct consequence of taking what you wanted. I looked at him steadily. Which means I was always going to give you what you needed. One way or another. When I was dead, and in the ground, you could have accessed the tissue then. You could have waited 6 weeks, and done this without any of it. Without the clinic. Without Melissa, Eva, and Jillian, and Gail, and Rico, and whatever you took from them. I paused. You didn't need my sister. You had what you came for in me, in a woman who was already dying, and all you had to do was wait. The eyes moved. Finally. A small adjustment, a flicker of something that, in a human face, I would have read as surprise. Not large, not dramatic, but real. Response. She has a different marker, I said. I know. Reed told me there are variants. But I also know you've been collecting this for a very long time. which means you've seen every variant that exists in the human population, which means you know which ones are redundant and which ones you genuinely need. And I think the reason you're standing here, instead of just taking us back to our rooms, is that you're running the same calculation I am. I watched his face, or the thing that corresponded to his face. You've been operating here for 12 years. A cop has been looking for my sister for 4 months. And if you send us back to our rooms, he is going to come through that door eventually regardless. And when he does, he is going to find a licensed clinic full of human beings who've had something removed from them. That is a different situation than the one you've been managing. I heard Carter then. The direction we'd come, his voice in the corridor. Not calling my name but using the flat-fall command voice he used when he was working. Short and certain. There was another voice too, raised, Mary's. And then, a sound I recognized from the times I'd watched Carter work, which was the particular impact of a door hitting a wall at speed, when someone who knows exactly what they're doing hits it. Carter had not waited for 11 p.m. He had not waited for the text to process through the system. He had been close and he had come. Elliot turned toward the sound. His attention went toward the noise, toward the thing he couldn't ignore, and in the exact moment his attention moved. I took Melissa's arm and we ran. Not elegantly. She stumbled once and I caught her, and we kept moving, toward Carter's voice, toward the sound of the door, and we came around a corner, and Carter was there in the corridor with his weapon in a two-handed grip, and his eyes moving the way trained eyes move through a space, cataloging every doorway, every angle, and he saw us and his face did the thing it always did when he was working hard not to let anything show. Went very still, then released. He said behind me. I put Melissa behind him. He moved us down the corridor in a controlled way that was not running because Carter in that mode does not run. He moves with the economy of someone who has thought about every possible contingency and decided which ones actually matter. He kept his weapon up. He kept us moving. We reached the front door, through it, and we crossed the gravel, and we reached his car, and he put Melissa in the back, and me in the passenger seat, and he was behind the wheel, and moving before either of us had fully closed our doors. The building grew small in the rearview mirror. The desert received us. After several miles, it was just the highway and the early morning light building in the east, and the building was gone. Carter did not speak until we were 20 miles clear. Then he said, "Tell me what happened, all of it." In order, I told him. I told him all of it in the flat sequential way he'd taught me, without editorializing, just the facts in sequence. Shh. He listened without interrupting. Melissa was asleep in the back seat before I finished. The genuine total sleep of someone who hasn't felt safe enough to sleep deeply in a very long time. When I finished, Carter was quiet for a mile. Then the one with the long fingers. Yes, and Elliot. And Reed. Yes. How many others in the facility who aren't, who are like them? I don't know. Patients are human, I'm certain of that. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for another few miles, watching the road. With the particular quality of attention he brought to things he hadn't finished working through. I let him work. Then he said, "You bought time by arguing with it. I bought time by telling it something it had apparently not calculated, that you were coming, that I existed, that a specific person existed," I said. "I think when they operate at their scale of time, individuals disappear. They see the species and the marker. They don't see the particular man who's been working a missing persons case for 4 months and who drives fast." I looked at him. "You drove fast," he said. "You sent the text 3 hours ago. I was hoping you were already nearby." I was already nearby. He didn't explain that. Didn't need him to. What Carter did with everything I gave him is its own story. He was methodical, and he was angry in the sustained way that careful men are angry. Quietly, for a long time, with direction and without waste. The facility was not there when other people went to look at it 8 months later. Whether that means it had moved or something else, I don't know. I made my peace with not knowing. Melissa came home. She came back slowly. The way you come back from something that has taken a fundamental piece of you. Not all the way, and not evenly. The vividness she'd always had, the feeling first quality, the loudness of her caring. Some of that came back, and some of it is still thinner than it was. She is still Melissa. She picks up on the second ring now, which for a long time she couldn't do. Small things. They accumulate. The 14-month scan was clean. Ham used words like remarkable and unprecedented. And I sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at the light through the blinds and did not cry. And I've been able to fully explain to anyone who wasn't there what that light looked like. Ordinary, flat, exactly the same as it had always been. The desert doesn't know. The light through the blinds doesn't know. The world goes on being itself regardless of what has happened in it. Thought many times about what Reed told me. A dying race, a long search, something essential, lost so far back that recovering it required millennia of careful attention to a species that didn't know it was being attended to. I have come to a conclusion that Melissa said better than I ever could. On the phone the day I called, to tell her the scans were clean, she said, "I think the God gene is just stubbornness. I think it's the thing that won't quit, and they've been trying to collect it for 10,000 years because they ran out of it themselves." I think she's right. I think they ran out of the willingness to keep going past the point where the math says stop. And I think they found it in a woman with terminal cancer who had already been told the math. 8 weeks, a death sentence that she sat with in a doctor's office, and then stood up and walked out of and went home with her hands tight on the wheel. You can take the sequence from the code. You cannot take the reason it exists. That part is not in the blood. That part is in the sister who was already crying. That part is in the man who was already driving. That part is in the decision, made in a flat, terrible silence, to be the one who functions. I've driven that stretch of highway 3 times since. The asphalt is the same. The desert is the same. The sky turns that deep-layered orange in the late afternoon. And the hawk is somewhere to the north, and the world is absolutely, completely indifferent to what happened there. I find that I don't mind. I am the evidence. Melissa is the evidence. The cancer that was there and then was not. That is the evidence. Whatever they needed badly enough to come this far and wait this long, I hope it helps them. I mean that without irony. I hope a dying civilization found what it was looking for in the last place it expected. Inside a malignancy, in a woman who was already running out of time, who had already decided she wasn't going to waste what was left. But I want them to know one thing. For whatever it's worth to a species that measures its history in epochs, the thing they needed was not in her alone. It was in the person sitting beside her with both hands on the wheel, feeling everything first. It was in the man already driving in the dark, because the math said she might need him. It was in the moment a door hits a wall and someone comes through it. You cannot extract that. It doesn't live in a sequence. It lives in the space between two people who are not yet willing to say goodbye. That's what they were always looking for. That's what they found. I hope it was worth the 12 hours. There are things I haven't told anyone except Carter. Not because they're secrets, exactly, but because they resist the kind of language that other people accept. I've gotten comfortable with that resistance. The things that matter most often do resist the ordinary words. One of them is this. In the weeks after we came home from the clinic, I started noticing the world differently. Not dramatically. True. Not of someone who has had a mystical experience and come back changed in a way they can't explain without sounding unhinged. More quietly than that. I noticed the specific weight of light in the early morning, the way it comes through a kitchen window at 7 o'clock in November and hits the edge of a coffee cup. I noticed the sound a car engine makes when it turns over on a cold morning. That particular cough and catch and settle. The way Melissa's voice changes when she's tired. A slight flattening on the ends of words, a conserving of effort. I had always known these things in the way you know things you're around every day, but I had not been attending to them. After the clinic, I attended to them. I think when you have had something taken from you without consent, when something has reached into your hours and removed them, you start paying a different quality of attention to the hours you have. Gratitude exactly, just attention. Just the deliberate choice to be present in the specific texture of your specific life. Melissa has said something similar in her own way. She said once, about a year after coming home, that she spends more time looking at things now. Not thinking about them, just looking. She said it like it was a private joke she was sharing carefully. knowing it sounded like something you'd find on a motivational poster, knowing that I would understand why it wasn't. It wasn't a lesson learned, it was a recalibration. Whatever they took from her during those months, some part of her instinctive forward momentum, some piece of the energy that used to carry her at speed through her days. What replaced it, over time, was something slower and more deliberate. Less vivid, yes, but also more present. I don't know whether that's the cirramace, that's a silver lining, or just the shape that survival takes when something has been rearranged. I also haven't told most people about the night 6 months after the clinic, when I drove that stretch of highway for the first time since. It was not planned. I was coming back from a work trip, and the most direct route ran through it, and I had told myself for months that I was fine with the highway, that it was just asphalt, and I had believed myself right up until I was a mile out, and my hands went tight on the wheel, and I understood that I was not, in fact, fine with the highway. I drove through it anyway. Not bravely. I want to be clear that I'm not telling this as a story about courage. I drove through it because it was on my way home, and because the alternative was pulling over on the shoulder and sitting there until the tightness in my hands went away, which might take a long time and would accomplish nothing. So I drove. The sky was doing the orange thing. Late afternoon, the sun going behind the hills, that deep layered burning light. The car felt exactly like any other car on any other stretch of road. The asphalt was the same asphalt. There was nothing to mark the specific 100 yards, where my sister had been beside me, and then had not been. No marker, no disruption of the ordinary. Nothing that acknowledged what had happened there. I drove through it and kept going, and the road was still the road on the other side, and after a few miles, I let myself think about what that meant. The highway doesn't carry it. The desert doesn't carry it. The world didn't absorb what happened the way I'd half expected it to, the way places in stories absorb the weight of what they've witnessed. The world went on being the world, and the weight of it was carried entirely by the people it had happened to, which is honest, I think. Which is actually the more useful truth than the other version. The world doesn't hold it so that you don't have to. You hold it, and you keep driving. Carter drove the highway once too, that I know of. He didn't tell me about it directly. He mentioned it once in passing, a year later, in the context of something else. Said he'd sit back through that way, on a return trip, and the road was very flat, and then moved on to whatever he'd actually meant to say. I didn't ask him to go back to it. I know what he was doing there, what private accounting he was running. Carter has always done his tallying privately. It's part of why I trust him. There are days I think about the others, about Eva, who had been a pediatric nurse for 11 years and could no longer make herself care about anything at all, about Gail, who had baked bread on Sundays. The facility was empty when people went to look. But the 4 of them had been real, and what had been done to them was real, and they were somewhere living with what remained. Carter followed up on all 4 of them through the official channels available to him. They were alive. They were functional, in the clinical sense. He told me that much, and I could hear in how he said it what he wasn't saying, which was that functional isn't the same thing as whole, and whole wasn't something he'd been able to do anything about. I think about them on quiet days, and I hope something came back. I hope, given enough time and enough slow, careful living, that whatever was extracted from them turned out to be something that the rest of them knew how to compensate for. I hope Eva found her way back to a room with children in it. I hope Gail's grandchildren kept sending her things, and that one day one of those things landed and she felt it. That's all I have for them, hope. The specific, unembellished, mystical hope of someone who understands she cannot fix the particular thing that was broken in them, and who decides that hoping for them is still worth doing anyway. Doing anyway. That is, I think, the phrase that runs under all of it. Worth checking. Worth looking for. Worth driving the highway one more time on a cold morning to find out whether you are, in fact, fine with it. The calculation that says this is unlikely to matter. It is always worth running that calculation and then doing the thing anyway. I had 8 weeks and I am here. Melissa had 4 months of having something removed from her one careful session at a time, and she is here. She picks up on the second ring. In us. whatever ancient quality they had lost and spent millennia trying to recover. I think the honest answer is that they were looking for precisely this. The willingness to keep showing up to the thing that is probably not going to work. The willingness to drive the highway again and find out. The inability, finally, to accept the terminal diagnosis as the last word. They found it. I hope it helped. I hope it was enough. I drove home that afternoon and called my sister from the driveway. And she picked up on the second ring, and I didn't say anything for a moment, just listened to her say, "Val?" with the slight impatience that means she's in the middle of something and is making time anyway because it's me. And I said I was on my way in, and she said good, and that was it. That was enough. That will always be enough.